Hi everyone, and welcome to the second video on assessment design the Kaplan way. If you haven't watched the first video yet, you may want to pause this one and come back to it after you've viewed the first video. In this presentation, we're going to look at the process of creating assessment artifacts such as the assessment specification, student-facing assessment overview, and student-facing assessment task instructions. There will be separate videos on how to create appropriate marking criteria for performance assessments and how to set up digitized assessments in, say, Mahara, Vili, or Cirrus. So let's start with what you'd have to start when you're developing your assessments, that is creating your assessment specification document. Now, you can access the template for this document via Teams. So let me show you how this works. So when you're in Essex Module Development Team, you'll look into the Files tab and you can see that there's a number of folders available to you. You need to click on Assessment Development Templates subfolder, which contains all the templates that you'll need for creating your assessment documentation. Sort them by name, and the first one that comes up on the list is Assessment Specification Template. If you click on this document, you can view the template in Teams. However, because this is a template document, you can see this in the extension if it says .x rather than docs, you won't be able to edit this within Teams. So you'll need to close this, and what you have to do is to actually download it to your computer to the preferred location. So you click on the breadcrumbs here and you download the file. You can see it's downloaded and it appears on your taskbar at the bottom of the screen. So if you click on that document now, it will open. When this document opens, you'll need to enable editing. So let's do that at the moment. And you'll see that at the moment it does not have any name. So first thing you need to do is actually save it to your preferred location using the naming conventions given for this project. So these would be the module name, _ assessment name, _ assessment document, _ submission 1. So if we were developing an assessment for maths, it would read maths, mid-module exam, assessment specification, submission 1. So let's now take a look at the components of this document. Assessment specification is the developer-facing document. It includes general information about a given assessment and details about how this assessment is to be constructed, a detailed description of each distinct part of this assessment. It is to serve as a key reference or a blueprint, if you like, for anyone who wishes to create a new version of this assessment. The template is set in a way which guides you through the completion of this document. So each part of this table provides you with a description of what information you must include. So for general assessment information part, this first box here in the table, you will need to specify what is the purpose of the assessment, what content it is to cover, how it will be structured, so how many sections there are, how are the items spread across the sections, how many items there are in total, what sort of marks are available, and the weighting of this assessment. The next section of the specification is where content construction is described in detail. So if you recall from the Kaplan Way intro video 1, where we talked about the assessment design, the starting point is to select the learning outcomes we want to assess in our assessment. So in most summative assessments, there are at least a couple of module learning outcomes which we need to evaluate. And each of these outcomes should really have their own designated assessment tasks or questions. Sometimes there might be overlap, and that's fine too, because we can design tasks which tap into a number of learning outcomes simultaneously. But with most examinations, it is often the case that we dedicate separate group of questions items to individual learning outcomes. So once you've identified module learning outcomes, it is also necessary to check what program learning outcomes this assessment is supposed to address it. So if you remember from the first video, I showed you the program assessment matrix. So that's a good moment when you're writing the assessment specification to actually check on the matrix what program learning outcomes and academic literacies we also need to address via this assessment. Moving on to the next section of the spec, we've got a sort of more specific instructional objective. These are more detailed than module learning outcomes, and they relate directly to specific content points from the module that you wish to assess. You then need to specify where and when the content that you want to assess was taught in a module. So it's sufficient to simply say which theme and which week given content comes from, or a range, so from theme 1 to 3, weeks 1 to 4, etc. You don't need to go as far as given a specific lesson number or activity number. Now, although the table asks you to specify the number of items and the number of marks, what actually is helpful is to first of all think about what type of task or what type of item you want to use to assess the specific learning outcomes that you've identified. Because depending on the choice and the importance of the learning outcome, you need to decide what items will test that learning outcome most appropriately. And you will also then be able to decide how many items you actually need to devote to this specific learning outcome. For outcomes which you believe to be more important or more complex, you may want to create more items and allocate more marks so that it's given more prominence within your assessment. So start with thinking about how I want to assess this learning outcome, and then decide how many items you need and how many marks you're going to give for each of those items. You then move on to actually producing an example of an item. You need to provide the entire item. So if it was a multiple choice question, you'd provide the question, the 4 options, and if there's any input with that item, you'd also include that. So in this example, we've got a diagram included as part of the MCQ question. Now, the last column, notes, details, content, limitations. This is a very important column. This is not for your comments, but it is actually to include detail to future developers, which will help them create the assessment in the future. So things such as if you want to specify any conditions for the items you're creating, or limitations. For instance, if you want input to be used, how long this input should be, what type of input, is it visual or is it text, or perhaps a podcast of some sort, a listening of some sort. How long should the questions be, so how many words and how many words in the options should we be giving, whether the questions should be, in MCQs in particular, should be structured as completion sentences or as questions, and things such as whether students are allowed to use formula sheets to answer specific questions. You should also refer to the level of complexity that you want to elicit in your item. It has to be very clear and detailed enough so that when the future developer uses your specification, they can recreate the assessment as you would envisage it without actually seeing the assessment example. So you need to repeat this process for all of the learning outcomes that you will be assessing in your assessment, and you always provide as much detail as possible. And remember to ensure adequate coverage of the learning outcomes with different tasks or question items. And once you've finished, you have to cross-reference again with the program assessment matrix to check if your assessment does address the relevant program learning outcomes and academic literacies that are specified there. If you haven't created assessment specifications before, the first one might be a bit challenging, but do not worry, we'll be at hand to support you and guide you through this. And the good news is that we only develop specs for summative assessments. So let's move on to assessment overviews now. Okay, Unlike assessment specification, an assessment overview is a student-facing document. Again, you can access it via Teams, as I demonstrated with the specification, and you have to save it in a similar fashion, giving it an appropriate name. We develop the overview for both assessments which are summative and formative. Since it is a student-facing document, it's absolutely crucial that we express the information within it in an accessible, clear, concise way, in a very sort of student-friendly language. Its function is to provide students with crucial information about their assessments pertaining to a given module. Basically, having read an assessment overview, each student should have a really good idea, be fully informed about what they can expect in a given assessment. So let's take a closer look on at what the template looks like. So once you've downloaded the template and opened it, you will see that a lot of documentation, a lot of information included in here is similar to what is in the assessment specification. So once you've created your spec, it should really be very straightforward to populate this document, the assessment overview. Again, the template is set so that it guides you through how to complete this. The parts highlighted in yellow are instructions to you which you need to delete after you've written your overview, and the text in black is basically to exemplify how each section can be completed. Again, please delete it after you've read through everything and are ready to complete with your own text. In terms of what's included in the assessment overview, you can see this on the left in a grade column. So you've got the information about the timing of assessment, about the type of assessment and what students need to do in the assessment, the number of questions that's included. We also provide them with example of questions or tasks. We give information about the weighting, the learning outcomes assessed, and what we cover in each assessment. We also provide them with information about how assessment is marked and any other important information that you wish to include, for instance, whether calculators are allowed or whether students need to bring any particular equipment for this assessment. Now, let's move on to assessment task instructions. If one of the assessments that you're working on is a performance assessment, so anything such as an essay, a report, a presentation or discussion, something that students have to produce a written or an oral piece of work or a sort of art artifact, you will need to provide them with a more detailed description of the tasks you expect them to complete than what we would normally have in the assessment overview. So for this purpose, we'd use the assessment task instruction template. And similarly to the previous two documents, you'll find templates on Teams. And also similar to the assessment overview, assessment task instructions is student-facing. So again, very clear student-friendly language is necessary when completing this document. We would require the assessment task instructions for both summative and formative assessments. And we have standardized this template so that it applies to all modules and programs which utilize performance assessments. So let's have a look at how this template looks like. So as with the previous two templates, again, this template provides you with guidance on the left here as to how you should be completing this document. And you also have examples on the right-hand side just to help you a little bit and provide you with some illustration of how instructions could be phrased. So once you've familiarized yourself with what's needed and are ready to complete the document, please delete the examples and input your own text. And once you've completed the document, you need to delete this table on the left-hand side completely. Let me just delete that one and readjust the width of this column so that the appearance of the document improves and the formatting is slightly better. Just to give you a little bit more information about what's actually included in the assessment task instructions. So the different sections provide students with information about the core performance task. So what it is that we expect them to produce. What is the final product? Is it a report? Is it a piece of art? Is it a presentation? A piece of recording or a video? Who are the audiences? Who's the intended recipient of this assessment? What the purpose is of this assessment? If applicable, particularly for written assessments, you also need to provide them with what sort of structure you expect them to follow, whether there are any subsections and subheadings, or whether there's a sequence of stages that you want them to work towards. Also, if you want students to refer to any particular theoretical framework or resources, you need to specify these. And then if you ask them to use resources, then you also need to specify what referencing style they should use to list all the resources used. And please don't forget to also include information about the expected word count. Similarly to the assessment overview, this assessment task instructions include reference to the learning outcomes that are being assessed, and also provide crucial information about how the assessment is supposed to be submitted or presented. So that will obviously depend on the assessment itself. We've got reference to the assessment marking and feedback, where the students actually will be receiving any feedback or not. Stop tour through the learning through the assessment documentation that we need to produce. Hope this was useful, and if you have any queries, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. There will be more videos included on the assessment guidance page in the VLE, so do come back, and thanks for watching. See you soon.